The Elder Scrolls is a franchise near and dear to me, so I was originally skeptical when ZeniMax announced Elder Scrolls Online about a decade ago. However, I remember playing the beta and more or less like what I played. Over the years I've been an on and off player, but I haven't really done much with the game outside of its base content. Recently, ESO released new content that follows up the base game storyline, which immediately interested me. Because of the news, I started playing the game again, but I was fortunate enough to receive a key from the publisher that lets me explore the new content as well as all the past expansions. A big thank you to the kind folks at ZeniMax. So I wanted to share my overall general thoughts about ESO as someone who's an Elder Scrolls fan, but not necessarily the biggest MMO fan. At a glance, the graphics may look kind of dated, and that's because they are. Being as the game is just over 10 years old, it was never going to compete with newer titles. That said, even on release, I didn't think the graphics of ESO looked better than even Skyrim, which was a game released about 3 years before. However, that's not to say the game looks bad. I think many areas look decent, and it was such a treat to see so many places in Tamriel come to life that weren't featured in the mainline Elder Scrolls game. The same could be said of the enemies and various character models for monsters and other creatures. It's cool to be able to see some of these creatures we've only read about in the game, or other creatures reimagined in ESO. However, the combat with said creatures and enemies is something that could be better. Combat at times can feel clunky, and I think that's a large part due to the animations. Combat animations feel stiff and lack impact. Weapons don't feel like they have weight behind them, and things can feel floaty since needing to connect the weapon to the enemy never quite feels necessary. I think it's a shame, but at this point, I don't see them ever giving this an overhaul, or if it's even possible for them to improve the overall combat experience. Although that's not to say the combat is bad, I do enjoy it and you do eventually get used to it. I just wish we didn't have to, and it just felt better to play. Many of the zones in ESO have a distinct feel to them, from the natural environments to the architecture of the buildings. And like any MMO, some zones are better than others. To actually talk specifically about the new content, I thought the tropical island of Solstice was alright so far. On one hand, many of the locations I really liked. I thought they had a Lost Island ruin feel to them. However, all the stretch of land in between these locations didn't feel very jungle-like to me, given how people describe Solstice in dialogue. I guess the sparseness of vegetation is there to not tank frame rates, especially with players who play the game on lower-end PCs, or maybe it's just an engine limitation. Moving past the graphics, the music is, of course, great and highly nostalgic, if you've played other Elder Scrolls titles. You'll hear several familiar tracks, or at least familiar parts of tracks in your explorations, along with a slew of new, well-composed pieces. It's music that fits the world perfectly and is used well to emphasize different points, like when in a climactic battle.
There's another Reaper! Take it out and find Paranor!
In what is an incredible feat for an MMO, all the dialogue in the game is fully voiced. That's absolutely mind-boggling to me, given just how much dialogue there is in the game. For the quests, obviously, but also just random people on the street having conversations. Or a random passerby that players can interact with but have absolutely no bearing on a quest. Additionally, there's a lot of extra dialogue with characters in between quest stages that can be interesting to listen to, and I imagine a lot of it goes completely unheard. There are quite a few repeat voices, but it still added such an extra layer of immersion that they didn't really need to do for an MMO, as practically no other MMO comes close besides maybe Star Wars: The Old Republic.
So you must destroy it. You cannot allow other monstrous beings to gain its power. That worm blames me for a choice that belonged to Meridia alone. She saw his arrogant, self-serving plans. He was a glutton for power and wished to use the Cynosure to control others. It's imperative that you destroy it, so he...
For a game as large as Elder Scrolls Online, or any MMO for that matter, the story writing will vary in quality from DLC to DLC, or even quest to quest. Overall, I think I'm usually engaged with whatever storyline I happen to be playing at the time in ESO. Although, I largely have only played the base game's main story along with each of the faction storylines, meaning the 3 factions you can align with, more on that in a bit, and a handful of guild quests and side quests that you come across out in the world. The overall premise, at least from the base game, is that the continent of Tamriel is at war. A power vacuum opened up as there was no emperor to rule, leaving the Ruby Throne up for grabs. 3 factions formed to fill that void and make a bid for power themselves in what is known as the Three Banners War. Those factions being the Daggerfall Covenant, the Ebonheart Pact, and the Eldmiri Dominion. Fans of Skyrim might recognize that last one, but keep in mind this is not the same Eldmiri Dominion of the 4th era. In fact, before I get too far ahead of myself, the events of ESO takes place about 1,000 years before the events of Skyrim. Anyway, the Eldmiri Dominion in ESO is actually inclusive of the other races, being the Bosmer, or Wood Elves, and Khajiit, the Cat People. So they're not the racist elitists we see in Skyrim.
That we are superior to men is an established fact.
Although that's not to say they don't exist, as that is actually a main theme of the Eldmiri Dominion's storyline, with how certain dissidents don't agree with Queen Irenne's new policies. Before I get too far off track though, the other factions also have their own storylines, but I admit that I don't really recall them despite my main character being with the Daggerfall Covenant. However, the overarching narrative that binds everything together is the Oblivion Crisis. And no, not this Oblivion Crisis. And honestly, they don't call it that, but it's instead referred to as the Plane Meld. However, it's essentially still a crisis that's coming from Oblivion, where the Daedra live. Or demons, but not quite, for the even less initiated in Elder Scrolls lore. Anyway, the Daedric Prince Molag Bal is seeking to merge his realm of Cold Harbor with the Mortal Plane, using his colossal dark anchors to pull Nirn further into his realm along with his army of Daedra pouring in from the other side. The people of Nirn are powerless to stop him, especially with the fact that Tamriel is at war with itself. But there's one they fear, sort of. In their tongue, he's... well, actually, I'm not sure what the Daedra calls you other than the Soulless One. And you're also called the Vestige by the blind old prophet you meet near the beginning of the game. But anyway, the player is obviously the Chosen One, tasked with directing the fight against Molag Bal, which has you saving certain powerful individuals, finding out some plot twists, and culminating in an epic climax. But anyway, I don't really want to get that much into the nitty-gritty of the story since we could be here forever, and that would be to just talk about the main storyline. Needless to say, I think fans of the Elder Scrolls will find something enjoyable here, and for those who aren't, probably will still find things enjoyable once they get over that initial hump of not understanding what any of the lore-specific people, places, and things are. Obviously, there is that new content, which is probably the main reason why keys were given out to people for coverage, so I probably should talk a bit about it. I did play some of the new content, as I was interested in it, but I will say that I felt the need to replay the old content just so it's all fresh in my head, as it had been years since I last did so. I started the prologue quest and was running into people who were all like,
"That little Princess I'll never mentioned he was sending you to meet me. How the tusk have you been, pal?"
And I'm just like,
I've never met this man in my life.
I think we'll also pay to play the Fighters Guild and probably the Mages Guild questlines before this as well. If anything, then definitely the Fighters Guild, because one of the characters reveals quite a big spoiler that I didn't know before doing the prologue quest. And before I go any further, there probably are a bit of spoilers here since this is obviously a continuing story to the base game, so either proceed at your own risk or skip ahead to the next section. The premise of the new content is that the Worm Cult, Manny Marco's merry band of necromancers, is seeking revenge against everyone in Tamriel who banded against them to stop the Plane Meld. So, you know, a lot of people since most mortal races didn't want to suddenly find themselves living in a nightmarish hellscape where torture and hard work seems to be the only thing to look forward to. And, oh wait, that's actually just real life. Well, that's depressing. Anyway, the Worm Cult have been attacking all over Tamriel, specifically targeting guild halls. They've also been using a new device called a Soul Reaper that essentially is stealing people's souls when they die, all in an attempt to curry favor with Molag Bal once again, or so it seems. Eventually, you're told that the Worm Cult is gathering at Solstice, a small island that houses a group of exiled High Elves who made their home there, alongside the native Tideborn and Stone Nest Argonians. I didn't get very far in the storyline since I want to replay the base storyline first, but I will say that once I got into the story proper, as in after the prologue, things didn't really seem that confusing or as disconnected as they did before, and I found myself engaged. One thing to point out that the devs plan on doing this time around is the large multi-week event for the content's narrative. On the island is a giant wall of magic that the cultists use to separate the west and eastern sides of Solstice. The initial batch of content has players going through the story and exploring the western half. The event will take place in different stages that require a massive amount of player support in order to help bring down the wall. Not quite sure how it will play out, but I'm kind of excited to try it out this coming October when the event goes live. I think players who end up giving Elder Scrolls Online a chance are either fans of the Elder Scrolls or they're fans of MMOs. Obviously there's a middle ground where you're fans of both, but I want to speak specifically to the former person as I feel that I fall into that category more. I'm someone who does play MMOs, but I've never played any one MMO that seriously, despite having tons of hours in many notable ones like World of Warcraft, Star Wars The Old Republic, and Guild Wars 2. However, much of that time is spent playing solo PvE content, and I hardly ever dive into endgame stuff, group content, PvP, crafting, etc. Essentially, I don't experience the full scale of an MMO, so I wouldn't say I'm a hardcore MMO player. On the other hand, I have hundreds of hours in the Elder Scrolls games, minus Daggerfall and Arena, and while we're all waiting for TES 6, the Elder Scrolls Online is there to maybe fill that gap. I've already talked about how the narrative and lore building is great for fans of the franchise, so now I want to take a moment to talk about how ESO tries to capture the feel of the Elder Scrolls in its gameplay, what it does well with it, and what it doesn't. Over the years, the game has had several sweeping changes that make it more in line with its single-player cousins. However, one thing ESO had from the start that I think works so well as an Elder Scrolls game is the ability to customize your class. Yes, there are classes, but if you played more than just Skyrim, then you'd know that technically there are classes in Elder Scrolls games. I can't speak for Arena and Daggerfall, but in Morrowind and Oblivion, the classes represented your major skill, or major and minor skills in the case of Morrowind. In ESO, it's similar to that. The base game has 4 classes being the Templar, Nightblade, Sorcerer, and Dragon Knight, and DLCs introduce the Warden, Necromancer, and Arcanist. Each class has 3 specific ability lines that focus on certain elements of the Holy Trinity, tank, healing, and damage. Players can mix and match abilities from each of these skill lines, which is already neat. ESO takes it further by also introducing skill lines for weapons, armor, guilds, and others. This allows for players to make wildly different classes even if the core class is exactly the same, based on their active and passive abilities chosen. Recently, the devs introduced subclassing, which now lets players go even further by taking skill lines from other classes and mixing them with their own. There are certain caveats to it though. Skill lines from subclassing takes longer to build up and costs more points to unlock things. Furthermore, you can have up to 3 different subclass skill lines, but can't choose any more until one gets maxed, and you always need to have at least one base class skill line active. And you can't access subclassing until you have at least one character at level 50, which admittedly doesn't take long given how easy it is to level and the fact that the game gives you a lot of items to boost XP gain. If all this choice sounds a bit dizzying to you, then yeah, you're not wrong, it's a lot. There is a built-in guide that players can use to select abilities based on the type of character they want to play, although this hasn't been updated for subclassing builds, and I honestly doubt that it will since subclassing is meant to be for more experienced players. If you're like me and is someone who doesn't really like thinking through all this, then don't worry. There are countless people making builds on various ESO resources. Or you can just choose whatever sounds good and worry about optimal builds later. The reason for this is that most of the PvE leveling content is easy and it won't really matter what you choose. Actually, I find this a bit disappointing because I remember when I first started playing the game, it wasn't like this. I guess there are talks of maybe adding in difficulty options for players, which would be pretty amazing depending on how it's implemented. Exploration is another aspect of ESO that I greatly enjoy and borrows nicely from traditional Elder Scrolls games. When wandering around the large open areas, players will come across dungeons, villages, ruins, and the like, with most offering some sort of side quest. What I particularly enjoyed is the fact that you can come across many of these quests dynamically, such as discovering a note on a random bandit you killed, or an NPC running up to you with a plea for help. I thought it was a refreshing change from the traditional MMO experience, where you go to a place, interact with everyone who has an exclamation mark above their head, and then return to them once you completed said objective. And this was how I felt about the exploration when the game first came out. However, at that time the zones were level gated, similar to the traditional MMO experience, which meant that if one area was for levels 25 to 30, and you were only level 15, then you couldn't really go there because everything would trounce you. With the one Tamriel update, the devs broke down those barriers and let players go anywhere they please, which really opens up the game. No longer are you limited in your progression, but instead you can go and explore anywhere. Additionally, it didn't matter your level, so a high level character could team up with a low level character and still have the enemies scaled to the player. The ability to explore anywhere is incredibly freeing and a very Elder Scrolls thing to do. However, I've noticed it does come with some problems, and that's mainly because many of the quests weren't written with that kind of progression in mind. So now you can perform quests out of order, which can lead to some rather confusing moments, like my aforementioned dilemma of not knowing who I was talking to, despite them knowing who I was. However, it goes even further because you could do a quest that's referencing something that happened, but then end up going and doing the quest where that said event actually happens, after completing the quest that should have been in the future.
People assume that time is a strict progression of cause to effect, but actually, from a non-linear, non-subjective viewpoint, it's more like a big ball of wibbly-wobbly, timey-wimey stuff.
Now, this obviously isn't an issue with the side quest or any of the other one-off quests, but I wish more thought could have been put into this. One might argue that it would limit the freedom of choosing, however they already have that established with the main quest, and I'm fairly certain the guild quest as well, where the next quest only starts after you completed the previous one. I'm not sure why that wasn't applied to the faction storylines, since those, to me, felt like the most fractured with this update. Overall, it's a good change though. I'd love for them to do another pass to some of the older writing to accommodate some of these changes, but I don't really expect that. One thing they did introduce recently that I liked was the ability to have more dialogue options as a way to roleplay your character. For most of the choices, it's mainly flavor text with an appropriate response from an NPC, but the tutorial prompt did suggest that this could change how the story goes at times. I'm not expecting anything crazy, but I appreciate their willingness to experiment with this, as embodying a character of your own making and doing what you want is a core pillar of the Elder Scrolls experience. Other changes the game eventually brought to the MMO were the additions of a crime and punishment system. At the time, this blew my mind because I didn't honestly think they were going to do this, but players can now also roleplay being sneaky thieves or bloodthirsty assassins. Or I guess just the typical Elder Scrolls player that takes everything not nailed to the ground and goes on the occasional murderous rampage. Alongside that, it brought along quest lines for the Thieves Guild and Dark Brotherhood, which I've yet to do and should get on that. I mention all these changes because I really want to emphasize the amount of freedom the game gives the player in an attempt to mimic an Elder Scrolls game. However, I still say that ESO is definitely an MMO first. The most immersion-breaking thing about Elder Scrolls Online is obviously all the other players. It's hard to imagine yourself as some sort of chosen one, when literally everyone else running around you is also the chosen one. I think it's especially egregious when you're in the middle of a tense quest in some dank dungeon somewhere, and then all of a sudden a player rolls up behind you and just starts annihilating all the enemies. It ruins the pacing, and I imagine it's especially annoying for players who want to play a sneaky rogue character. A part of me feels that it would be great if the player had an option to make an instance of a quest area, but I don't think we'll see anything like that. Furthermore, I imagine most Elder Scrolls players tend to play the games in first person because, let's face it, third person isn't really that good in any Elder Scrolls game. But in ESO, I'd say that third person is the way to go. It was originally designed to be a third person game, but they added in first person as a last minute thing before launch. It's cool using it every now and again, but I just don't think it's well suited for combat. It always feels a bit clunky for me to play ESO in first person, but it's a nice addition that they didn't need to do. While I had said that I don't usually do much else other than solo PvE content, ESO is a game where I do like the crafting system and want to do more of. The standard foundation of the crafting system is what you'd expect from any other crafting system in a game. Players have to go out, find resources, and then use them to make certain items such as weapons, armor, potions, etc. Each crafting discipline, such as woodworking or provisioning, have their own associated skill lines to buy passive buffs. Some can help you gather resources faster with things like hirelings that give you daily mats, and making resources easier to see out in the world while exploring. What sets ESO apart is that each item can have a trait and are made in a specific style. Traits are additional effects that could be applied to a weapon or armor depending on if you use the associated gemstone. At first, the player doesn't know how to apply any traits to their crafts and instead needs to research them by breaking down an associated item that has that trait. This takes several real-time hours, but I thought it was a fun way to track down pieces that have traits you want, as well as also creating a hoarding mentality, which, once again, is the Elder Scrolls way. Styles are for appearance purposes, but starting out, a player only knows how to craft in their own chosen race's style, and it requires the associated crafting materials to craft in that style once you learn it. Players need to track down other tomes and scrolls that teach them how to craft in new styles. I mean, you could just find someone selling them too, I suppose, but where's the fun in that? I really like the idea of needing to go out in the world and learn how to make weapons and armors from different cultures. I mean, stat-wise, an iron sword is the same no matter what style it is, but I appreciate the visual flair they provide. Additionally, there are special crafting stations out in the world that provide specific set bonuses that you could only craft at those specific stations. Personally, I think this is a genius way to get out there and explore. I mean, maybe most optimal builds would find those set bonuses trash, I don't really know. The concept behind it all is really cool though. Once again, I'm sure I could go on and on talking about more aspects of the game in greater detail, or if I actually put more time to other aspects such as Cyrodiil World PvP or the large group PvE trials, then I'd be able to have this video be so much longer. I think this is a good overview of my thoughts on the game though. Overall, it's a solid MMO and one that I think does enough to make it feel like an Elder Scrolls game, even if it's not quite what we're all waiting for with The Elder Scrolls 6. And that brings us to my final thoughts, but first, if you're enjoying the review or found it helpful, then please consider giving it a like, as that helps me out greatly with the YouTube algorithm gods. For this definitely not a first impression, but maybe not quite a review, I put in... that's actually a good question. According to my playtime on just my main character, I have almost 6 days, and I have had other characters that I played a decent amount of time with. I'd say I probably easily have over 150 hours, but probably closer to 200, and most of that has been with the base game content. You can get the base game that also includes the Morrowind chapter for $19.99 USD, but that goes on sale all the time for about $5. Additionally, you can get the premium edition for $79.99, which includes the base game, new content pass, and all of the previous DLC chapter expansions, which is just an insane amount of content. Admittedly, many of the chapters before the recent content pass, and excluding some of the early expansions, split the DLC's main story into 2 packs. The main expansion pack, which has the first half, but then a smaller DLC that has the second half, and none of those are included in the premium edition. Which kinda sucks, especially since their new content pass includes everything that would originally be split into a dungeon DLC, the big expansion DLC, and the smaller story DLC to finish the story. Alternatively, you could pay for an ESO subscription, which gives you access to all of the DLC and a few other perks. I've never felt the need to do that, but the option is there for people who have no issues with paying a monthly sub and don't want to deal with the somewhat confusing nature of the DLC. If you played the game, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you haven't, then let me know if it sounds like something you'd be interested in, or if you have any other questions. I hope this video helped you in some small way, and if it did, then please consider leaving a like, comment, subscribe, or whatever it is you feel like doing. Thanks for watching, and have a nice day.